So I'd like to welcome you all out to this EdTech panel hosted by Arbisa. Tonight, we will be talking about global perspectives on EdTech. And I am the moderator, your host, Kay Banks, and I'm really excited for this topic. We got some great questions. I'd like to give it time now for our panel to go ahead and introduce themselves for a few moments. Let's start with you, Al.
Well, hi there, folks. I'm Al Kingsley. I'm based in the UK. In terms of my experience in EdTech and education, I always introduce myself as a man of two hats. So 30 years as an EdTech CEO, so I'm starting to get the hang of the space and the technology. And in parallel to that, for the last 20 years, I am chair of a multi-academy trust, a cluster of schools in the UK. I chair an alternative provision, which is for young people that struggle in mainstream education. I sit on the Regional Schools Directors Board for the East of England, which manages the academies, programme and school delivery across the East of England. And then a bit of a fusion between the two. I'm also chair of the British Education Suppliers Association EdTech Group, so representing the voices of EdTech vendors across the UK and understanding market insights internationally.
Wow, that was quite the pedigree there. So very impressive. Thank you so much for being a part of our panel. We welcome you and we're excited to hear your input. So
my pleasure.
That's all right, Cedric, let's introduce yourself.
Awesome, thank you, I appreciate it. So for me, I guess I can talk about the lead into education and EdTech to start. My background is originally in chemistry. I actually became a chemist before becoming a teacher, based in the US, here in the States. And making that pivot initially going into teaching was definitely very eye-opening, just in regards to the education system and inner workings outside of my experience being a student at a certain point in time, and working through kind of those, I guess, kind of, I don't know, ranks, if you will. I went into instructional coaching. Our last school-based role was assistant principal, and made the pivot into EdTech actually during the pandemic, but that wasn't necessarily the reason. That was primarily due to the fact that I wanted to be home, work remotely, becoming a new father at that time. So I was able to do so, and have been in the space now for several years, working in product, kind of curriculum development work, a lot of STEM-based things, as you would probably imagine. Some professional learning aspects. And at this point now, I am also the founder of EDU HUSTLE, which is primarily more of a movement in support of educators. And the mission there is guiding educators to maximizing their time, talent, and earning potential, with things like consideration for what else they can do, which could lead them into EdTech. So sharing expertise and just information and resources there, and just continuing to build and grow and share capacity, and learn more than anything else.
Awesome. That sounds amazing. I'm super excited to hear your perspective on things as well. So obviously we're talking about the global EdTech, and so a lot of our questions will come from a global perspective, so to speak. So jumping it off with this question, how does the adoption and integration of EdTech differ across countries and regions, from your perspective and your experience?
Would you like me to kick off?
Yes, absolutely. Let's do it.
So I'm fortunate enough, although I'm based in the UK, I work with ministries of education and school districts around the world. And there are some common themes about technology being used. Well, you have to always put the caveat of when it's used effectively and with purpose, it can be a really powerful enabler. There's a natural persuasion which starts with geography, in terms of some regions and countries around the world have a different growth curve in terms of the deployment of technology into education. And in many regards, the last few years, as Cedric sort of alluded to, coming and getting involved in EdTech with the pandemic, there was, that was a real catalyst for as looking at EdTech in a different way. And historically around the world, one of the biggest barriers with education has always been place-based limitations. If you live in a deprived area, you don't perhaps have access to universities and the resources and the experience that you might get. Mm-hmm. And suddenly we saw, with technology providing a kind of a breakdown of the walls between the classroom and your home learning spaces, that personalized learning pathway, that technology became a bit of a leveler. And obviously, one of the key things that I work heavily in is very much about looking at that digital poverty aspect of how do we create a level playing field. What we tend to see, and I think the pandemic was a really good way of just showing how the worldwide education sector moved quite quickly, is that when there's an opportunity for new technology, where there's something of interest, and maybe now we're all inclined to say, you mean AI, Al? Well, maybe, but over the last few years, it's been VR, it's been XR, it's been all sorts of other themes. You tend to find that around the world, the international school sector tends to move quickest because it has the financial capacity, and they are able to have greater autonomy in the way that they deliver their learning process. Then you find it tends to be what I would say is countries where there is a tight ecosystem, where government provides a coordinated strategy for delivery of education, that you will see adoption supported by guidance and best practice. And then you find other areas where it tends to be more case by case. The UK, we're a small bit of land, but we make up 4 home countries. And yet those countries of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have completely different approaches. And actually, of the 4, England is the one that's least connected and least scheduled. You move across the water to France, a much bigger country, and they very much operate rectorate by rectorate, small region by region by region. And yet, similarly, we've done projects working with the Ministry of Education in Kenya, where they took an approach of, we're just going to roll out just over 1 million devices to the equivalent of their year 7, start of their secondary education journey, and we'll have a coordinated project. Back 10 years ago, the same was happening in the Middle East. The UAE had their smart learning project, and to change them. But you see countries like Estonia and Finland that's ranked very highly, but their introduction of digital skills starts much, much earlier in the early years setting through. And that tends to feed through. The one thing, and Cedric, I'm sure will have some views on it, that I see consistently, is the biggest barrier is not how quickly countries and schools are adopting technology. It's how quickly they're realizing that professional development for staff and actually providing that support, so that there's actually clarity in terms of pedagogy and purpose with the use of technology, is actually coordinated. Because more often than not, the technology arrives and the teachers are assumed, well, you better get on YouTube, you better figure out how to get the best out of that. And that often is the barrier to successful technology adoption.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I can add, just even thinking about that kind of last segment, I think that Al added related to the professional development and professional learning for teachers in particular. Just thinking back to even whenever the pandemic onset in 2020, and being an assistant principal at that time, we like everybody else went home, and that's where learning took place. The issues that we began to see, of course, then are more so related to, well, how do we navigate this virtual environment, this space, this world now? Because it was more of a luxury than a necessity before. So if I haven't necessarily been tapping into the, this platform or this resource, even though we've always had access to it, we have the licenses, the school or district is paying for it, but we're in the classroom. So I don't necessarily have to put, my students on these, devices unless they're working in centers or some other kind of independent type of work or enrichment type of, thinking. So that, I think, just really kind of blew the lid off things and highlighted a lot of areas of need related to what I was mentioning. But I think one of the greater conversations around adoption in particular, and of course I'm speaking, from the point of view and perspective of being in the States, is, and I try to share this with educators all the time, especially when they're considering, new opportunities in their careers, is there is a stark difference from what I've seen between the education system and the education industry, as you see it. So with that in mind, the idea then becomes ultimately for the industry to figure out, well, what need can we find a solution for in the system? Because for us, honestly, it just would seem as though the system's not going anywhere, right? It's upheld by, there's funding, federal funding, tax dollars, all those things, right? You can kind of ramble those things off. However, the industry side needs the system, right? The system doesn't need the industry. So there has to be almost this race, right? That's why, even when we're talking about AI, we see these races, of these different, programs, platforms, and then, essentially solutions for problems and concerns that they see in the system, right? We have the best thing, right? We can do this, so pick us. So then when you get to the point of adoption, the dollars and things like that are there in most cases. However, you do have issues and concerns around disparity, similar to what Al mentioned, based on, locale or region and where you're based, where, we've seen things, even to take it out of the technological perspective and say, we have areas in the states, designated as food deserts where children don't have access, adequate, access to food. So that also can go into thinking about what's happening in the schools, and we don't have the one-to-one devices and those things. And then also on top of that, to kind of bring it full circle, are the teachers trained in actually implementing and using the technology anyway? So you can put the one-to-one devices in place, but there also has to be other things that kind of align with that. And I think sometimes there can be some haste whenever it comes to adoption, and just bringing in the new flashy thing. But as my father-in-law, often says, haste makes waste. So we got to be really careful with that.
Okay, could I jump back in just to follow up on Cedric's comments? Because I think there's loads you've shared there that's really worthy of picking. There's one that's fundamental to which is education technology vendors who create a product and then try and find a need will fail. The fundamental success of long-standing edtech companies is built around that cornerstone of co-production. You have to be involved in education. You have to be involved in schools to understand the pain points, to then go away and co-produce solutions that are appropriate. And if vendors don't do that, then they're not successful, which is why in many regards, one of the biggest growth areas, which, I'm involved in many that I try and work with and support, is educators taking a step out of the teaching profession and into the edtech space, taking their experience and shaping tools and resources that they know will mitigate a challenge they've got. I'd also argue that's probably the biggest reason why the last 3 years, the term digital strategy has suddenly appeared. Within our schools, districts around the world, actually having a clear plan of what are we looking to do, why are we doing it, and how are we going to measure it, how we shape that co-production from all the key stakeholders of what our journey for the next 5 years will be digital within our schools. And absolutely, I will always argue, much as I'm a huge EdTech fan, it's about less is more. Sometimes it's about 1 or 2 things that you implement, getting it embedded, being established with it. And when you can measure impact, it gives you the confidence to layer on. The final bit, which maybe we could come back to, is we have a mindset, which I totally understand and accept, that education's here to stay and this is what it looks like. The British education system is something that's been the same for almost 300 years. This idea that children would learn key skills wherever they were in the Commonwealth, and then they would suddenly have equitable skills to drop into a workplace. And things like the PISA rankings I mentioned, snapshot of 15-year-old children on this fixed set of measures, and that's a high-performing school system. Well, actually, in many of those countries, children leave thinking, my God, never again. I've spent the last 12 years of intensive learning to memorize this information that I want. And right now, the project that they're undertaking at the moment is to look for a new standard of measuring a high-performing school system. And I love the fact that the terminology they use is an education system that promotes human flourishing. And it's much more focused about not just acquisition of knowledge, because we all get that some of that for context, and we need our math and literacy skills. But it's about all those skills that are so important to the workplace now, nevermore with the advent of AI. Digital skills, critical thinking skills, resilience, challenge, thinking about social, emotional, mental health, and some really cool stuff like discovering and understanding about awe and wonder. Why do you appreciate art? Why do you look at scenery and think this is a man it through somehow? So with that in mind, this technology kind of gives us the option to think about, actually, what does the future workplace want? What do the skills want? And then you kind of haven't got a choice. You've got to start introducing technology in school, because those are the skills children need when they leave.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, thank you. You guys just touched on so many things. It was great. You both mentioned the pandemic and how education needs to be changed, needs to be revamped. And in some regions, there's still skepticism, even after the pandemic, about the quality of online education. So, in your opinion, how can EdTech providers and educational institutions address concerns about the efficacy of online learning?
I mean, I would say at first, honestly, you have to know what those concerns are. That's kind of the first step, is really understanding. I think, even something that Al mentioned is kind of that co-production of things. You have to actually be in the space in real time in some capacity to understand where the need is. Because at that point, if you go to the doctor and you don't tell them, oh, my knee is hurting, I mean, how can they help your knee, right? That's to me, just kind of the simplest way to kind of view that. But thinking more so about efficacy related to online education, I mean, I think there are some strides being taken. I mean, when you look at things like adaptive and assistive technology, in support of, maybe there's a visual impairment or something like that, there's definitely, things kind of being put in place there. But I think before you can really get to consideration for, well, what's happening and how can we fix the virtual space, there should be some consideration for where are the gaps and barriers in the physical space that, in my experience and opinion, can and will actually show up in the virtual space as well. So there's actually some transference there related to people, right? I would say students, but we got to actually humanize that these are people, right? Even the youngest learners, because I can tell you even stories, and my wife is in special education, where we've seen students who really struggled in the physical environment, but somehow end up thriving in the virtual space, and vice versa. And I think that there needs to be more, I guess, dare I say, research being done into that. Like, well, what creates these differences, and why is it that this student can show up in this way in this aspect, but not here? And I think when you start to dig into that, then you can start to come up with answers, as to, well, how do we make this better? And I think, some of it boils down to, I mean, not all things are going to work for all people. I mean, it's just kind of a fair point to say. I mean, even though, we believe in standards and standardization, and the one key thing that I always have is that, the standards and the way that we standardize things, are not standard. It doesn't make sense because people aren't standard. So when we take a step back and really kind of look at it more holistically, I think that makes more sense. But I think that it also makes it a little bit more intricate, because you have to really take into account all of those human aspects of things, which then becomes like, all right, now we're dealing with sociology and behavior, which is a whole nother beast. But you can't ignore those factors, because there's going to be things that consistently pop up and appear, and you're going to have anomalies in situations. But, considering, well, what's working, streamline cases in the, online learning, virtual, digital space, whatever you want to call it, and then just trying to figure out, well, how can we replicate efforts, and also where's the need greatest, who is being missed, and how can we figure out a solution to put something in place that would then support that particular group versus let's just charge on forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's an interesting one. Cedric's a chemist, so as he said, it's a periodic table of students. No two are the same, and the learning environments are very different. I actually think this is quite a complicated one, but I actually think there's actually, you know, I'll be controversial. Many educators say, you know, technology will never replace good teaching and learning. And I understand that from a professional perspective. I think we undervalue the bit that the teacher does that isn't about imparting knowledge, but is about developing the relationship, the nurture, the support, the broader holistic for a child. And so in that regard, I think we are heading ultimately to a hybrid education system. And I say that because if we look around the world right now, some of the biggest pressures in Europe, the biggest pressure post-pandemic is getting young people back into school. More and more parents are homeschooling because they've seen that as both a risk, but their child was unsettled. There's lots of social, emotional, mental health challenges, children not engaging in learning anymore, not seeing a point, some real challenges. And frankly, anywhere in the world right now, our biggest challenge is retaining teachers and recruiting new teachers to the profession. There's massive shortage of supply. There is ultimately a market force that says when you get less and less capacity to deliver with a growing cohort, there will need to be adapting to how they can do something in a hybrid way. I love the point about special education, where in my alternative provision education, we had loads of disengaged learners from very challenging backgrounds who weren't connecting with education. And our biggest barrier was getting them into the school building. During the pandemic, we had the highest rates of engagement we'd ever got with our learners, because online, it was a different way of learning. They didn't feel that they were entering the building, but they were happy to engage. Maybe some of it comes onto then the kind of tools that you can use to engage, where it doesn't always feel like it's learning, but there's different ways that you can deliver on technology. In terms of the research and evidence, there is a growing bit of research. I mean, I think the first thing is we measure the success of online learning based on, frankly, requesting a few million teachers to pivot in a couple of weeks, and the sector could pivot like that so quickly. But nonetheless, the reality was it wasn't done super effectively. I saw, working with international schools in March 2000, they were pretty much wanting to replicate the school day in a virtual sense. But to immediately flip and ask young learners to spend 5-6 hours on a screen in a synchronous learning experience, just not pathways, then you start to see an opportunity to say, well, this isn't about replacing that absolutely core bit of the human interaction of teacher and student, but actually we could spend more time focusing on developing a child's skills and confidence in the classroom. And we could also then use personalized learning tools to help cement content knowledge and context. And I think this is about us recognizing that some of the choices that we think we have in education, we don't have. We can't control how many parents have confidence sending their child to school. We can't control what industry, the workplace, expects the skill set of an employee to be. And as such, as education, we have to adapt to make sure the child is best equipped to be at that point. So we're looking 10 years ahead and thinking, what are the skills that our learners are going to need? And I can assure you, given that for the last 10 years, we could ask Alexa and Siri some pretty basic questions, or actually some complicated questions, being able to remember the capitals of every state in the US or every element on the periodic table, to use the earlier example, becomes less and less important. Understanding how to ask the right questions, how to get the information that's relevant, and how to put it in context becomes much more important. So there is a change coming, but much like most countries in Europe, I think the US is the same. Educators from a government level are much less keen to move. And that's typically because nobody likes making decisions unless they can start and finish them within one electoral cycle and claim the success of the project against their badge. And education transformation is not a quick fix. It's got to be a long-term plan. I'll stop preaching now. Sorry, I get quite passionate on that topic, but there you are.
No, thank you. You kind of led to the next question, and you gave your opinion, but I guess I'll direct this one to Cedric. As more educational content and resources become available online, how do you see the role of traditional brick and mortar educational institutions evolving in different parts of the world? And Al gave us the example. He said maybe hybrid is where we're going. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would have to lean to that. I mean, it's interesting kind of thinking about the institution side of things, but then also working in the EdTech space and seeing the growth in some of the shifts there, because, being here in the States and growing up in the public school system, a lot of the companies that, published the books that I learned from when I was a child are still around and relevant now. However, what they've had to do is make adaptations and pivot themselves, where, and of course, based on growth and expansion of the companies, because they've been around forever, they have been able to, or I would say kind of had to, honestly, either create their own digital platform or offerings, or purchase something else, right? Acquire another subset. But that hasn't necessarily been the complete case that I've seen in terms of, schools and institutions themselves. I think it's happening, but I don't know about the pace of it. And we've definitely seen, of course, with the onset of the pandemic and everything like that, there was that pivot where it was like, oh, we have to go virtual, and there were some implementation around virtual pathways and things like that related to students. But I don't know necessarily if those things, in many cases, sustained. And honestly, I don't know. I'm just thinking, was there a thought process around what that would ultimately look like down the line, in the future perspective of, if we create this virtual academy and still also have the physical building and space, to where there is, either some choice or there's some way that we can optimize the situation for the greater good of the student, right, and our families. How can we make that happen? And I just think that things became kind of rushed in a sense. And I think that there should be some revisiting of that if those things were kind of taken away, because I know at a certain point, there was definitely kind of a mass, kind of push back into the schools. Whereas, the virtual kind of onset was happening, and you hear about some of more of the, kind of, two-sided aspects of things where, we have this virtual pathway, and then we also, we have people coming into the building. But I think that a lot of it, from what I understand and the people that I've spoken with, a lot of it end up kind of dissolving and fizzling out, which I don't necessarily know if that was the best situation, because even considering some of the work that I've done in support of homeschools, and I know Al mentioned that, the growth and expansion that he's seen, it's the same, in the States, where, it was essentially a mass exodus, out of the public schools for families going home. And what I also saw during that time in support of, different co-ops and things like that through, just social media apps where families were convening and creating large groups, and the parents themselves were the ones getting onto Zoom calls and leading, sessions and teaching. They had already been prepared for it more than what I saw working in the school system, where it was kind of, for them, it was like, well, I mean, this is what we've been doing anyway. We just won't necessarily do our more physical convening that we plan, whenever we, get our children together to socialize at the museum or what have you, right? We can't do those things. However, the learning that we've always engaged in has been equipped and kind of set up and prepared for something like this, where, regardless of what happens in the outside world, we're good here, right? Because we've already been consistently doing this. We know about these online platforms. We've been leveraging these tools and preparing, because we've had a little bit more autonomy in how, for homeschool parents, a lot more autonomy in terms of how they can expose their children to certain things versus the students who are in the school. So when it's, okay, we have to go back into the buildings now, but we're going to use virtual, platforms and systems and tools. It's like, you kind of just, raise an eyebrow and kind of scratch your head and say, well, we're going back into a physical space to use digital tools. But what happened to the conversation around using, these tools in the virtual sector, especially for, again, students who were blossoming and kind of just doing really well in that environment? And then what happens down the line, for the students who go back into the buildings and they struggle? That's just always my primary question.
Just a couple of points now. I mean, it really resonates. I think one of the problems is normally in education, we're quite good at planning things. We're focusing on what we need to do, our areas of development, how we're planning our curriculum for the year. When we were forced to pivot quite quickly, and digital went from perhaps being number 10 on the priority list to number 1 or 2, the natural persuasion as the pandemic moved towards an end was, we've got so many other things to think about. Let's go back to what we know best. We've kind of had digital overload, so let's have a digital detox and go back to, as we would call it, our traditional way of delivering teaching and learning. And the problem really that I see consistently around the world, and in some cases it's amazing, but often it is a problem, is it requires really strong leadership at the top in schools. Because typically when there's an issue, when there's a challenge, your senior leadership are the people that take a grip, come up with a plan of action, develop a strategy, and then feed that through with the workforce. When it comes to digital, the biggest problem we have is the people who are the most senior leaders in our schools don't necessarily have their own practical experience of using technology within the classroom themselves. It's because it's so new, it's fresh, it's changing all the time. So it takes the strength to create that digital strategy by actually empowering middle leaders, and actually often junior teachers who've got examples of how they've used technology either effectively in their school, or quite often from a school that they've come from and joined your school or district. And so actually what this requires now is this bit about, well, you get out what you put in. You've got to have a plan and purpose for when you're going to use digital tools, how you're going to use them, and be bold enough to say some of the best lessons don't involve any technology at all, but other lessons can be hugely empowered. Thinking of the sort of the SAMA model, where we don't want to just always be substituting a textbook for a digital sheet of paper, but we want to be looking at how we can augment, modify, and actually redefine and create these kind of better experiences that will engage our learners. So I think leadership has had the post-pandemic. Externally, the message is it's AI, it's technology, there's loads of great things to think about. Internally, it's staff retention and recruitment, finance management and budgets in our schools, children's well-being and mental health, and trying to find a way to catch up on what was seen as the lost learning. And so in that regards, it's like we've had technology being shouted at us for the last 2 years as the enabler. Can we take a pause, please? And I'd argue it's entirely understandable. But at the same time, what you don't want to do is lose that muscle memory. You've acquired skills as teachers for the last 2 years, and there's a risk you lose that, and then you have to reignite. Bearing in mind how many more devices are in our schools now post-pandemic than there was before pandemic. So we also want to make sure that we don't just let them all gather dust and have to start all over again with that process.
You guys are amazing. I love this. Is great. I'm a former educator myself. And so hearing these perspectives lets me know, like, oh, I do align with these ideas, so this is really great information. So with your expertise and your exposure to different tools and resources, can both of you share an example or multiple examples of successful EdTech implementations within the school systems or abroad, however you have seen them, something that's been successfully implemented?
Do you want a specific tool, or are we just speaking broadly?
Either one. Specifics are great, but if you have something, an initiative that you've heard of or have been a part of that is something that's been implemented well in the EdTech space.
Sure. Let's see. Well, I mean, I am seeing, of course, some of the I guess understanding around some of the AI tools, and I mean, I definitely lean into thinking about maybe not a specific tool in particular, but things related to gamification. I've seen those, do really well in support of, student learning, because of course, naturally in states, I mean, I would think everywhere, but children engage heavily with, video games and, that type of pathway. So being able to kind of leverage some of that interest, Roblox and things like that are, of course, are definitely kind of major things. But I think even just considering some of the work that I've done related to that, whenever you get into, and this is maybe, early years, and when I say early years, maybe this is like 5 years ago, right? It's eons. So things like online learning platforms like your code.orgs, your Scratches, things like that, that are still somewhat, I would say, parallel to the types of interests that students might have when they engage with a Roblox or something along those lines. But they're also learning, the programming and the coding skills associated with the creation of something like that. Those things, to me, especially with a lot of our younger students, and definitely even some of our older students who, and I mean, as disheartening as it is to say, like, tend to kind of lose some of that, that spark sometimes. And I think that, that's one of the gripes I might have with the system itself, especially related to, young women and girls whenever they're, kind of progressing into like the middle grades, particularly in the Black and brown communities. We see it kind of a tear off. But whenever you have those types of resources and supports in place, and there's also, hopefully, and an educator who also has kind of a charge for those types of things, even if they don't code or know Python or C++ or anything like that themselves. I think just the inquiry behind those things and the kind of push and allow students to just go and just explore, right? So I guess to round about that question and answer it, it would simply be anything more so related to gamification, but more so specifically if you want to use, names. Code.org, in my experience, has been pretty awesome with that. Just, students getting access to being able to learn programming, coding, and manipulate video game play, as well as Scratch, which is kind of a similar idea where you can create these stories and, block coding, going into learning some more of the text. And one actual resource that I was really fond of as well was actually, I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with Spheros, but they're just like the little spherical robots that I used to actually use from grades pre-K on up, basically, dealing with some of the enrichment kind of focus, but not really just for students, in acceleration pathways. It's just kind of open exploration. But whenever those things have kind of a tiered approach, and to give a quick example of what that looks like for a Sphero, that robot, the little ball that you can program, it has an initial kind of pathway where you can actually draw, right, the code, right, and you tie that to learning with a 4-year-old child. Let's work on our shapes. Draw a square on the tablet, right, and they hit run. They run the program. The robot does a square, and then you can progress into the block coding that some of the middle to upper elementary students might do. And then you can get into, all right, let's actually do some text coding with older students. So whenever you're actually able to have that direct connection, and definitely for younger students, something a little bit more tangible. But when you can bring something in like that actually appeals to the interest of the student, and video games being one of them, then I think that's kind of always a winner, as long as you continue to build on it and add more layers so that there's more learning and it's not just like this fun thing that we're doing.
How did I guess with Cedric loving STEM that he'd get Sphero in there? I agree with you. Fantastic tool. There's some really good competitions they run in the UK where they have a pretty much like a warehouse with a maze and teams of students compete. So you're not just doing the coding, as Cedric explained, but you've also got other children who are doing the measuring of the pathway and the shortest route, and they're thinking tactically as a team how to do it. And it's fantastic in terms of developing a really big mix of skills. I'll take perhaps a different angle, which is one of the things I think about. At the very beginning, we talked about how the advent of technology removes some of that place-based limitation on young people and their opportunities. So a child now, in theory, can be at school in a deprived area of the UK, and their first job could be with a tech company in Silicon Valley because they can work online and they can work remotely. But ironically, with all this new technology, there's a risk that the technology itself creates the digital divide, the haves and the have-nots. One, if the technology becomes complex so that it has accessibility barriers to some of our learners. So I'm always a real fan of accessibility tools. Obviously, there's some great inbuilt tools, both Microsoft and Google and so on. But there are companies like TextHelp that do some really good accessibility tools. People like Merlin Mind, who empower the voice-activated engagement, but with curated resources through AI that are education and age appropriate. So that's some really cool stuff. There's also things like Classroom Cloud, which is actually shepherd and nurture, see what the kids are doing, control what they're doing in the classroom, but also keep them safe online at the same time. So they can access resources, but you're not putting them at risk by doing it. And then I think on the bigger sense, there are tools that are developing. Ironically, we see lots at the moment online, which is all about generative AI. And sometimes it includes me creating silly pictures of myself riding on a camel or something. But actually within schools right now, the bigger growth is on non-generative AI. We capture vast amounts of data we have in our, depending on where you are at the world, you might call it an MIS, an SIS or whatever, but that's student data. And actually the effective way of interpreting that data to identify for teachers where there are gaps in learning and progress, and actually focus in where perhaps a cohort in one school in the district is underperforming to another, allows opportunity for intervention much sooner. In the same way as the personalized learning pathways we talked about can utilize non-generative to make more informed decisions. The generative AI stuff right now actually is predominantly focused on saving teachers' time, being the first pass at doing some lesson preparation, lesson planning content, not the final pass, because again, it comes back to effective questioning and using the right tools. So I think what we're always looking at is we want to make technology be there to do what it can do, save time in support and enhance learning, provide better access. But at the same time, there's always this balancing, which is, but we've got to make sure we continue to contain equity so that all learners can have it. In the same way as, I love the potential with the metaverse, but if you have to have $1,000 headset to join the party, I'm less keen, because that won't be accessible to all of our learners. And then we get a gap in experiences and access to content when they're not in school. So I think it's incumbent on us within our schools to try and look at technology that's agnostic and flexible, that always has an inclusivity as part of our checklist of what we want to adopt.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for that. Switching gears a little bit with this next question. How can EdTech solutions support cross-cultural exchange and collaboration among students and educators from different countries? Kind of thinking about that global perspective on education. How can EdTech help?
I think it's really about looking at global issues, things that impact not just one particular space, one particular country. The first thing that pops into my head is water. It's everywhere. We all need it. And there are many places that have issues concerning their water supply, right? And that's whether you're in the US and you go across, across the globe, you're going to come across somewhere where it's, we don't have a sufficient clean water supply, whatever the case is, there's always that. So I think if you take a step back and really consider just what are the needs of people in order for them to sustain life and potentially thrive, and then see what things are impeding upon that, you kind of get your answer there, right? That you really think about, well, these are the needs that we have, in X number of countries across the globe. This is a problem. Then at that point, you can kind of say, well, we have at least a launch point for where we can focus our energies and our concern. Because if we come out and we have some type of, push behind this, the likelihood of other people getting behind what we're doing is going to be much higher, because we've already looked at the data. Right? We understand that this is a necessity. It's not a luxury type of thing where, again, great, if you can have the $1,000 headset, but being able to drink a glass of water is universal. So how do we make that a reality for as many people as possible by leveraging the solutions and what we're creating and what we're putting out into the space? And then also, I think promoting awareness around those things as well, especially for young people. And I can just close this out with a story that I could recall. I was teaching an enrichment class for elementary students. And the model of it was basically that the students could select essentially whatever topic of study that they wanted. And it was more so focusing on the emphasis of understanding how to effectively do research and apply that to produce either a project, product, or service idea, and maybe even something to go along with that. And I can't tell you how many students I had that came up with ideas that were relative and pertinent to other parts of the world and fixing their problems, right? Or even different parts of the country here. I have literally had 3rd and 4th grade students, 8, 9 years old, create, based on their research, different funds to where they could actually send money to shelters or to hurricane relief. So if the children can see it, right, then we should definitely be able to. And I think that with the creation of a lot of these solutions and these tools and resources, I think that the driver should just be kind of focused on where the need is greatest, which, if we look globally, where are the major issues that we all see?
Thank you.
I love that. I just want to be friends with Cedric now. I really like that.
Right.
Consider it done.
It aligns quite nicely, because one of the things I was going to say, there's lots of projects involving technology built around the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and different strands around that, which absolutely some of those strands are absolutely aligned with climate change and those kind of broader topics. I was thinking back when we think about technology, probably 15 years ago, we were involved in a project across Europe and connecting with sub-Saharan Africa. It was called Connected Classrooms, that involved at the time, frankly, things like Skype, but having children in classrooms in different parts of the world sharing their experiences. And what we see now is that same conversation happening, except using AI. We speak one language and it comes out the speakers in another, and we're able to allow the children to connect by translating the language and share their project work on tasks together, often linked to Cedric said around looking at broader understanding of community and culture and countries, which absolutely is a huge part of enriching our learners. And actually, if you want to just kind of connect the dots more with our technology, well, actually, we have children in one of our infant schools. So children that are from age 4 to 7. It's very much for the youngest learners. And we have a converted school bus that inside has technology, and the children at an early age will use augmented reality to activity. They have VR headsets that allow them for the first time to visit museums or the Amazon rainforest or the desert. And whilst they're very young, and this is about giving them experience, we want experience to link to curriculum. For some of our learners, they've never seen, a cow in a field. They've never experienced the opportunity to go to the beach, to go to a museum. And so technology unlocks the opportunity to show something that will spark discussion. And hopefully with our little learners, it sparks inquiry. It sparks that awe and wonder. How can I find out more? What does that about? Which then gives the catalyst to creative writing or a desire to go and find out more. So again, I think with technology, when we think of all these things, whether it's Skype becoming these fantastic virtual environments now where we can have conversations and translate our text to experience cultures and geography around the world, that's where technology is that term I used before. It's that enabler, that facilitator. What it really needs, though, is it needs that human at the front of the class to put what we're seeing and learning in context and make sure that it's aligned with some kind of progression in terms of the curriculum. And that's the skill that you don't use a computer for. You use the of technology, and then hopefully fund the people that are in the position to understand to do the efficacy and research. So for some, there's loads of external organizations that undertake evaluations of technology from a curriculum, a pedagogical perspective, from a user interaction point of view, because obviously we've learned in the last few years that it's not the tools with the most features, it's the tools that are the easiest, the most flexible to use, that actually resonate most in our schools. So I would argue the best message to government when it comes to, and keep your noses out of the bit about how to enhance, because whenever you get involved, you break it.
Fair, that's valid. Thank you, Cedric.
Points. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it again, even just more so kind of reflecting on the last question. And, I think the one concern that I often have related to when we're looking, across, even within in the US, like looking at state versus state, and then also now looking globally at countries, it's like, well, at what point, do we then get to an idea of dealing with like competition? And I feel like if you get to that aspect of it, and one group is trying to edge out the other, then you kind of forget everything. So for me, like the only way to kind of neutralize that situation is to really look at, again, things that are impacting everybody. What are the things that, regardless of whether I beat you to the punch, we can't necessarily beat this thing, right? We can't defeat this unless we come together. So what I see just in life is, in a lot of regard, unless we're forced to really kind of become this one unified thing, it unfortunately doesn't necessarily happen that way as often, I think, as it should. But the one kind of key urge that I would have, and again, kind of like thinking about, governments and things like that, you draw the question of, do they really have children's best interests at heart and really thinking about the future? Because when you put it into that perspective, and I look at my son, who is 3 years old, and I look at a 3-year-old in England and a 3-year-old in Saudi Arabia, it's like, okay, this is bigger than me. And it's not necessarily, really having to do with us adults or whomever, in terms of what we're doing. It's really going to ultimately be about them. And if I look at my son in the same way that you know, of a mother or father, we need to actually, and I'll use a word that's actually in, the sustainable goals is, what do we need to do to actually sustain, and what thing do we need to protect so that they can at least thrive, just to even give them the opportunity, if they so choose, that when they become an adult, that they can now compete, right? Because we just can't allow certain things to kind of continue and fester and grow, and expect that quality of life is going to be there for the people that we say that we care the most about. And at the end of the day, honestly, I care, of course, about, my family, and yeah, great. But I think the ultimate kind of focus of it is, are you willing to step outside of yourself and put something else, kind of ahead of that? And for me, as a parent, and as an educator, and someone who just cares for people, I would be that. But the question would then be, is everybody else going to be in that same kind of vein? And if you can get enough people kind of on that bus, then great, and you can move. But again, I would think it would have to kind of come back to, what are the things that we're not going to be able to outrun, right? Even if I run faster than you, it's going to catch you. What are those things? And we can address them. And then, maybe we can go back to trying to figure out who's best after. But we all have the same villain that we have to, come together and defeat.
One thing I would just add on that, because that really resonates, is, the education space, stakeholders from technology, from school leaders to teachers, to teaching assistants, to network managers in schools, that dialogue, like a bit of a microcosm of our chat here, is actually leading the way. There are massive conversations and exercises and sharing of best practice going on at the moment. There's some great new work, if you're in the US, from ISTE. They've now got some new guidance on how to select tools, where you step through don't spend loads of time looking and selecting things until you've really thought about all these topics. It's signposted for you. They have the same EEF, Education Evidence Foundation here in the UK, that provides lots of different evidence and resources about it. There's loads of people in the education space, including my good self, that have sort of said, I'll write it down in a book, I'll share it. There's the information that, and often the answer is not the answers, it's the questions that we're sharing, because every school's different, every cohort's different. So, it's not about follow this recipe and you'll be successful. It's when the time is right, ask these questions and see whether you come up with similar answers. And if you do, there's some steps. I love the way that you reflect on it. My fear sometimes is, because it's scary, because there's lots of new technology, because the world is changing so rapidly, the easiest solution is to just close the curtains and pretend it's not happening outside. And that's not going to fix the problem. But it doesn't mean you have to run out the front door and embrace all the technology next week. It's understanding that there's a pace of change, and the pace is controlled and dictated by your resources, financially and time within your school, and the needs of your children. And the kids always have to be the driver. Why are we doing it? Will it benefit them? If the answer is no, then don't bother going there.
Yeah. Guys, this has been very monumental for me. I'm sure all of the listeners and viewers as well. Some of the things you said will definitely really resonate with them, in terms of education and on a global aspect. And so over the past hour, you guys have showed or have displayed and talked about use cases, resources that you've known, examples of EdTech and how effective they can be, along with some of the discrepancies within our current educational system. And so now I want to give you a few moments to kind of share your closing remarks on your global perspective on EdTech. And whoever would like to go first, I know it's not
I'll keep it really short and sweet for the effective adoption of technology in our schools. The biggest one is to reduce teacher workload and pressure. The other is to support our learners on their own personalized journey, not to replace education in the traditional sense, but to support and supplement. It's happening around the world, but I think the onus is all those involved to share what does work, what doesn't work, and we learn from that collectively as a global group of people who care passionately about education. Don't get caught up in the shiny. Follow the evidence, follow the case studies and the white papers of your peers and your colleagues who've been on those journeys. Make sure you've got a digital plan and go at your own speed.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah, for me, I would basically lean in and say, at least give things a chance to start. I think too often things are ruled out, or we can get to a point where, you know, we say, oh, this is too much, it's overload. So if necessary, start slow. And that's something I've been supporting folks with as well. And just really thinking about what aspects, you know, are going to make your life, the people around you's lives better, you know, more efficient, and how can we, you know, benefit and leverage there. But then also related to the schools, again, I would just really say it's considering any type of implementation, really taking inventory of what the need is of the populace, and then building globally, considering, you know, honestly looking at what's working and where, and how can we then create systems and situations where we can have cross collaboration and really get more information about these things before, you know, we make brash decisions. Because I think often there can be either analysis paralysis and kind of, you know, a lot of hesitancy toward things, or, you know, fools rush in. And I think that sometimes it really would do us a great deal of benefit to stop, take a breath, and take a step back and look at things for what it actually is, gather as much information as possible, but not necessarily get stuck in kind of thinking about things. So yeah, last thing would essentially be, you know, gain as much knowledge as possible, but don't be so afraid that you never actually take a step forward. And when you do that, be sure that you are moving with the best intention, and ultimately that what you are doing would, I guess, hopefully be for the benefit of someone other than yourself.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you both so much for your contributions to this discussion. It's been really great. So thank you so much. And this will conclude our RB discussion on the global perspectives on EdTech. So thank you all for participating, and we'll see you guys next time.